Tonight we convene for the sixth time to get a glimpse into the life that awaits us if we have the patience and the temerity to stick around for it. There was a time, I'm sure, when in our present perspective human life was simple. Some things were certain, preordained, unvarying. For example, life and death were clear, and there was almost never any mistake about which was which. But now we linger hesitantly on the verge of a new era in which even such apparently unmistakable guidelines are becoming blurred, in which there may no longer be much validity in the concept of generations, in which it may be possible for one human being to sample a half a dozen different centuries. Can you imagine being given a lecture at the age of 50 by your grandfather, who was only 47? Well, there are worse things, I think. This is the time of an attempt to amalgamate the wisdom of disparate fields in order that we may learn somehow to get along in a world so different from the one to which we have been accustomed. And this evening, we have a man eminently fitted to provide us with some glimpses as to the path that we may profitably follow. Dr. Willard Goodwin is professor of urology at UCLA, received his bachelor's degree at the University of California and his MD at Johns Hopkins. There followed periods in which he served in the military and became a pathologist at Johns Hopkins, an instructor in urology at Johns Hopkins, and finally, after many advances up the ladder of his profession, he came to UCLA in 1951, since which time he has risen to the rank of professor of urology. He has also produced an astonishing array of publications and memberships in professional organizations. The breadth of his capacity to synthesize knowledge from different fields is illustrated in a few of the titles about which he has written, which I would like to tell you about. For instance, in the field of cross-hormonal studies, he's written a paper that deals with estrogen production by the testis. That may not confuse everybody, but in the field of cross-species comparisons, take, for instance, a malignant testis tumor with liver metastasis in a grizzly bear. And there are also the possibilities of cross-historical comparisons from one epoch to another. For example, Benjamin Franklin's bladder stone. Now, I don't have to cite any further references to show you that the breadth of this man's interest matches the scope of the presentations you've heard in the past. Among the titles I have not read you are some that constitute the pioneering work in the field of organ transplantation, which is one of the subjects about which we are to hear tonight. In the field of kidney transplantation, which happens at the moment to be one of the better developed, Dr. Goodwin is acknowledged as a world authority. He has recently returned from a conference in London conducted under the auspices of the SIBA Foundation, about which I think he will tell us something, which dealt, as do we and so many other gatherings today, with the implications for human values of the new scientific field which he is pioneering. I'm very happy to present to you now Dr. Willard Goodwin.
Thank you, Dr. Gorney. I didn't realize you'd pick out that bibliography. I hope I don't disappoint you tonight. How many in the audience can remember 39 years ago this week, May 20th, 1927, when Charles Lindbergh took off for the first solo nonstop flight, 33 and a half hours to Paris? Well, how many at that time who were astonished, as we all must have been by that feat, would have imagined that within a space of 40 years, man would be walking in space and girdling the globe and probing the moon? This is an astonishing advance, and we may be on the threshold of a similar era of discovery and advance as concerns the prolongation of life and repairs or substitutions of broken parts of the human body. In some ways, this topic brings to mind Oliver Wendell Holmes' great poem, The Deacon's Masterpiece, The Wonderful One-Horse Shay. And I'd like to read a little bit from it because it sort of puts into focus what I'm going to talk about. Have you heard of the wonderful one-horse shay that was built in such a logical way? It ran 100 years to a day. And then of a sudden, but stay, I'll tell you what happened without delay. Scaring the parson into fits, frightening people out of their wits. Have you ever heard of that, I say? 1755, Georgius Secundus was then alive, snuffy old drone from the German hive. That was the year when Lisbon town saw the earth open and gulp her down, and Braddock's army was done brown, left without a scalp to its crown. It was on the terrible earthquake day that the deacon finished the one-horse shay. Now, in building of chaises, I'll tell you what, there is always somewhere a weakest spot. In hub, tire, felloe, in spring or sill, in panel or crossbar, or floor or sill, in screw bolt, thorough brace, lurking still, find it somewhere you must and will, above or below or without or within, and that's the reason beyond a doubt a chaise breaks down but doesn't wear out. But the deacon swore, as deacons do, with an I do yum and an I tell you, that he would build one shay to beat the town and the country and all the country round. It should be so built that it couldn't break down. For, said the deacon, 'tis mighty plain that the weakest place must stand the strain. And the way to fix it is, I maintain, is only just to make that place as strong as the rest. Well, you know, the poem goes on and tells how he built his shay and how it lasted for 100 years, and at the end of 100 years, his successor to the shay was riding in it, and then we hear of what happened. The parson was working on his Sunday text, and he'd got to fifthly and stopped perplexed in what the Moses was coming next, and all at once the horse stood still close by the meeting house on the hill. First a shiver and then a thrill, then something decidedly like a spill, and the parson was sitting upon a rock at 9:30 by the meeting house clock, just the hour of the earthquake shock. What do you think the parson found when he got up and stared around? The poor old chaise in a heap or a mound, as if it had been to the mill and ground. You see, of course, if you're not a dunce, how it went to pieces all at once. All at once and nothing first, just as bubbles do when they burst. End of the wonderful one-horse shay. Logic is logic, all I say. Well, as physicians, we'd be quite content if the human body would do as well as a one-horse shay. But unfortunately, it tends to wear out in certain parts. And so one of the things that we're working on now is to try to replenish parts when they wear out, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Perhaps, though, before I go too far, I should try to define death if we're going to discuss the prolongation of life or the control of the timing of death. There are several kinds of death: cytological death, physiological death, intellectual death. You remember Gracie Fields said, he's dead but he won't lie down. Spiritual death, theological death, and horror of horrors, social death. Cytological death, which is the death of the cell, is the ultimate biological death. However, it's not inevitable, and some cells have been kept alive for many years and generations in artificial environments. For example, a woman who had a cancer of the cervix many years ago contributed some of her cells to a laboratory experiment, and they became the HeLa strain, which is now still living in many laboratories throughout the world. And in a way, this woman, who's now long since dead, could be said to be immortal. One definition of physiological death, which I like and like to use, is that given by Francis Moore, professor of surgery at Harvard, in his book Give and Take, which is about transplantation. Quote, "The fearfully and wonderfully made human organism is legally and socially dead when the brain has stopped working, and its deterioration from lack of blood flow and oxygen is irreversible, and the heart has stopped beating. Of all the tissues in the body, the brain is most sensitive to lack of oxygen and to lack of sugar, both of which must be brought to it in a steadily pulsating flow of bright red blood from the heart and lungs. When this lack of blood flow or of oxygen is total and complete for more than 8 to 10 minutes, there is absolute cessation of brain function. Reflexes cease, the pupils become widely dilated, the electroencephalogram shows no activity, and the patient indeed is dead." Well, so much for a working definition of death. However, for people who are going to use organs, possibly from people who've recently died, they have to have a more careful definition even than that. And at the recent SIBA conference, which Dr. Gorney mentioned, we spent many hours trying to develop an acceptable definition of the conditions for death, which would be irreversible and which would make it proper to use the dead body as a donor for organs for transplantation. The following conditions were proposed by Dr. Alexandre of Brussels, and most everyone accepted them. Complete bilateral dilatation of the pupils of the eyes, complete lack of nerve reflexes, absence of spontaneous respiration for 5 minutes, lack of blood pressure even though the heart could still be beating, a flat electroencephalogram, that is, no brain waves. There have been discussions concerning suspended animation of an entire body, a human body, with the idea of reanimation at a later time so that we could have the lecture from the grandfather, which Dr. Gorney mentioned, sort of a deep freeze for posterity. This is possible in a limited way in some laboratory animals and in lower living forms. It seems unlikely to be an immediate prospect as concerns man or other primates, and even if it could be looked forward to for some time in the future, it seems likely to me that it might cause more trouble for the lawyers than it would for the doctors. I can imagine the horror of a lawyer who was trying to deal with the estate or the will of someone who was presumably in a state of suspended animation. Some experiments have been done to suspend brain activity by controlled refrigeration with the idea of reanimation. It would seem likely that this might be the weakest link in the chain of suspended animation, and that even if the brain is revived and shows evidence of life, that it might not function in a normal way. And this is one of the things that seems to me basic in our discussion of prolongation of life and use of organs, is that it's not enough just to have life. It has to be a functional life with some meaning to it. I'd like to spend most of my time talking about the prospects of transplantation of organs and tissues. Already, as you know, many tissues are commonly used for transplantations. For example, blood transfusions, corneal grafts for damaged eyes, bone grafts, and some types of tendon material and arterial grafts are useful. My greatest interest here at UCLA has been in kidney transplantation, which may serve as a model tonight for a discussion of other types of transplantation, such as liver, heart, lungs, and other organs. It seems quite likely that the barriers to successful permanent performance of these organ grafts will be breached, and that in appropriate cases, grafting procedures will become commonplace. This raises a number of questions which need to be thought about. I propose to try to list some of these questions, but not necessarily to answer them. And if I could have the lights out and have the slides on. The idea of transplantation of organs or tissues is very old in the mind of man. In this slide, you see the creation of Eve coming out of Adam. Now, this is a kind of transplantation, as you can see, and perhaps it was the first transplantation. Surely one of the first urological operations was circumcision. And in the next slide, you see depicted a miracle, which is a famous episode in the lives of Saints Cosmas and Damian. They're credited with the transplantation of a leg from a cadaver to a living man who had lost his leg. You can see the cadaver down there at the bottom of the picture, and here's the leg being transplanted to this man who'd lost his leg. My friend, the Negro photographer over at the Veterans Hospital who made this slide, asked me what it was, and I told him, and he grinned and he said, "No, it isn't. That's the first case of integration." In the next slide, we see a picture of a dog with more than one head. The dog who's in room 121 has 3 heads, and it's a statue of Cerberus, who guarded the river Styx with Chiron. But this dog in here has 2 heads, and he's a live dog, and both of those heads are alive. This transplant picture was taken from Life magazine. It is a picture of a Russian experiment which was done a few years ago, but which followed the original same experiment done by Carell and Guthrie in Chicago in 1910. And they found out that they could do this, but that always the grafted head would be rejected. And that is the problem of rejection, which we'll discuss a little bit later. You might ask, when this does happen for people, where will you put the extra head? Will you carry it under your arm, or incubus style as we see it here? In the next slide, which we'll keep on for a few minutes, we see a list of the various possibilities of spare parts for the human body. First, mechanical appliances such as prostheses, an artificial limb, or those would be a removable thing, an artificial limb or an artificial eyeball, something like that, toupee, built-in things such as a heart valve of a mechanical nature, which are now in common use, and then artificial organs, which certainly have their place, although most people would agree that living organs are better if you can use them. Ones that are temporarily connected to the patient, as for example a kidney or an external heart. Now, it's already possible, and has been for some time, to keep a patient with kidney failure alive on an artificial kidney machine for months and even years. The longest such cases to date are more than 5 years. However, this is costly and inconvenient, and it has been impossible to apply this technique to every person who is dying of kidney failure. And the people who are working foremost in this field have found it necessary to choose who should be the recipient of this type of treatment. This very act of choosing has brought into focus the fact that a prolonged life must be meaningful and useful. But the question may be asked, how is this to be decided, and by whom? The cost of this type of program is staggering and has prohibited a widespread use of an approved medical form of treatment for the first time in medical history. And then we have here built-in organs, such as a mechanical heart, as you read about in the newspaper last week, Dr. DeBakey's experiment. And in the next column, we see transplanted organs. auto transplants. These are transplants within the same person or animal to himself, as for example, if you had a bad burn on your face, they could take skin from your abdomen and cover the burn on your face, and that would be an auto transplant. Homotransplants are transplants from another individual of the same species, as for example, if one man gives another man his kidney or his heart or his liver. And these could come from living volunteers, which is one way it's done now with kidneys, or can come from what we call free transplants. That's when a kidney that is normal and healthy has to be removed for a good medical reason. It can be put into someone else, and can come from cadavers, that is, from dead people. And finally, at the bottom, heterotransplants. This is organs or tissues from one species to another, as from a dog to a cat, or from a chimpanzee to a man. This is an intriguing prospect for the future, but at the moment, these things are uniformly doomed to failure. Thus, for my purposes, I'm going to limit most of the present discussion to homotransplants and talk about living volunteers and cadavers. And I'm going to talk about homotransplants of the kidney. In the next slide, we see the present technique of a kidney transplantation. The kidney is removed from its normal position and placed in the human pelvis near the urinary bladder, as you see in this diagram. Its blood supply is reconstituted by anastomosis of the arteries and the veins to the vessels that go to the legs and the lower part of the body, and the ureter, which is this structure angling down here, which carries the urine from the kidney, is sewn into the urinary bladder in a new position. Now, in the case of identical twins, which are a special case, this works permanently. In the case of other people, that kidney is rejected over a longer or shorter period of time, providing it's been technically successful. Incidentally, the technique to make this possible was known as long ago as Alexis Carrel, 1902 to 1912, who developed the techniques of transplanting organs. This particular operation was first done successfully between identical twins at the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital in Boston in 1954. So that's how recent it is. In the next slide, we see a photograph of a pair of identical twins who exchanged a kidney. We exchanged a kidney from the well one, who is the one on your left, to the sick one here at UCLA in 1961. That's now, it was July 1961, so it'll soon be 5 years. They're both still alive and in good health, and the formerly sick one, who's on your right, is living on his brother's kidney. This works permanently in his case and in the case of other identical twins. But when there's a lack of identity, as for example between brothers and sisters or mothers and children or unrelated persons, these homotransplantations are at present doomed to ultimate failure because the body rejects them with an immune response. And the next slide, here's a photograph of two transplanted kidneys in a dog. The kidney on your right in this room, or below in room 121, is the dog's own kidney, which was removed from its normal position and placed here next to the bladder. The kidney, and that's an auto transplant and would be expected to survive. The kidney on your left, or above in room 121, is a kidney from another dog which was transplanted the same day, and when this picture was made 7 days later, is beginning to be rejected. It's a homotransplant. You will notice that it's swollen and black and is beginning to die. And now we can turn off the slides and turn on the lights. This is the problem that's faced in clinical transplantation of tissues. It has, however, in a limited way, been controlled by the use of drugs. And there are perhaps 8 or 10 people living in the world for more than 3 years after such a transplantation from non-twins. In other words, the rule has been broken by the use of technical manipulations with drugs. But it still isn't completely broken. In our present state of knowledge, these people, we think, are all doomed to die when the organ is finally rejected, unless they can get another organ from somewhere else. But the fact that we've been able to advance even this far seems to give us a lead into the future. We may, I think, safely assume that there will come a time when it will be commonplace to remove organs, such as the kidney, from one person and to put them into another person with expectation of long survival. This raises many questions which I should like to outline for you. I don't propose to answer them, although some of them we've had to make up answers to sort of de facto in order to carry on with the work we're doing. I hope that Professor Prost will be able to answer some of these questions for us. And here I'll just list these questions, and you can think about them as we go along. Is it right to take a well person and make him sick by removing a healthy organ, even if he is a volunteer donor, to give to a sick person? Is it legal to do this? Is the surgeon justified in doing it? Is it morally correct? Does the church approve of it? Will the insurance company pay for the hospitalization? If it is all right in the case of an adult, is it also all right in the case of a child? At what age should one be able to decide for himself the answer to these questions? Should prisoners be allowed to be volunteer donors for transplantation of organs? If a patient can be kept alive on an artificial kidney indefinitely, that is, an external kidney, who should decide which patient would be put on this kidney? Does the patient have a right to refuse it or to stop it once it's started? If he does stop it once it's started, is that suicide, which is illegal both in the laws of the land and also in the laws of the church? Who decides who should receive an artificial kidney or who should receive a transplanted kidney? Who will pay for this? Is it proper to transplant animal organs to human beings? Is it proper to use the organs of a dead person? If this is done, the transplantation must be started within minutes after the actual death of the person, before the organs suffer cellular death. And how do we know when the person is dead? Using the definition we had earlier, we can accept that they're dead, but by then the kidneys, which we want so much to use to keep someone else alive, may have already begun to die and may not be useful to us. And would undertakers approve of this? We might be cutting them out of their undertaking fees if we use the bodies in this way. Would it be proper to use the organs of a person who was dying and unconscious but had not yet been pronounced dead? This has actually happened elsewhere. It caused a great deal of trouble, as you might imagine, although actually the circumstances were beyond reproach except for the idea of that question. Is it proper to transplant the heart or the liver, which are single organs, and in which case the donor must certainly be dead, and the recipient would almost certainly die if the transplantation does not work? How do you know if a donor really wants to be a volunteer? Is it possible for a relative of a sick person to be objective and truly give a voluntary consent to removal of a kidney? Just this past week, we had our 50th kidney transplantation here at UCLA Hospital, and the night before the operation, I was talking to the mother who was going to give her kidney to her son, and I said, "Well, are you sure you want to do it?" She'd come here all the way from a distant place. She said, "Yes, I wouldn't back out now." But she wasn't all that cheerful about it either. She's all right, though, fortunately. What is the risk of being a donor for a kidney transplant, a live donor? Actually, it's probably very slim. So far, of living donors, there probably been close to 1,000, and so far, no deaths. Although, ultimately, in the scheme of things, there would have to be, simply from the dangers of an surgical operation. It's been calculated by Professor Amberger of Paris that this risk is about 7 chances in 10,000. Is it all right to use blood transfusions from cadavers, from dead people? Is it all right for a person to give permission for his body to be used for an organ transplantation before he dies? Is it permissible to take an organ from a patient who volunteers, who's dying of cancer and says, yes, I'm going to die next month, you can have my organ now? Should people be paid for giving their organs? And if so, how much? And would there be a different price for a living organ donor versus a dead organ donor? Could there be a black market in transplanting organs? Should we have laws that make it possible for doctors to use the organs of any person who dies in the hospital without any further consent? Might it be possible to preserve some organs, as for example hearts and brains, and to use them as accessory organs for space travel in the future? For example, if someone were going to take a 40 or 50-year journey and needed to have a couple of spare hearts or brains. Would it ever be proper to transplant the brain? If you transplanted a brain to another person, who would be boss? And once again, where would you put the extra head? At the present time, is it better to use related volunteer donors, which seem to have a slight edge as far as the success of the procedure, the long-range success, or would it be better to use cadaver donors for transplantations of kidneys? Should the same doctors who do the transplantation be the ones to decide when a potential dying donor is actually dead? When a patient has an irreversible condition and is being kept alive by a heart-lung machine, is it justified to turn off the electric current which runs the machine? If so, when is it justified? Should the machine be started in the first place? How does one give consent to have an organ removed for transplantation? Is it justified to keep a person alive when he cannot function normally? Pope Pius is reported to have said, quote, "Without vital function, life is not life in the true sense of the word." What security does the donor have? Does society owe him any debt for having volunteered to give a kidney as a living donor? At UCLA, we have experience now with some 51 human kidney transplantations. The longest surviving, except for the twins, will be 3 years next month. And that patient received a kidney from a man who had his kidney removed at the Veterans Hospital because it had a cancer in the tube that went from the kidney to the bladder. So that was removed, the cancer was cut off, and then the kidney was put into this man. And it'll be 3 years that he's living on that kidney next month. Recently, he tried to commit suicide. Should we have tried to save his life when he tried to commit suicide? Actually, he was brought back to life, and now he says he's sorry. Should we have done the transplantation in the first place on such an ungrateful wretch? One of our successful transplantations, a young woman has become pregnant. She's living on the kidney from her brother. Should this be allowed? She's taking powerful poisonous drugs to suppress the rejection reaction. What effect will this have on the baby that's growing inside her womb? Should we terminate the pregnancy, or should we wait and see what nature's experiment is going to do? What effect will this have on her and her family? Should she have been sterilized by tubal ligation at the time of kidney transplantation in order to prevent this pregnancy? Another successful transplant, who will be 3 years this fall, is a young woman living on her mother's kidney. She now goes to college and is busy and happy and thinking of getting married. Should she be allowed to get married? Who decides these things? Thus, we have many issues ahead of us In some of these things, we've had to make arbitrary or the best decisions we could reach. Others have not yet been settled. It's not too early to think about them and to wonder about them. One thing that seems certain to me is that even when it becomes possible to guarantee the success of transplantation of kidneys and other organs to prolong life, the use of this should be limited to patients who are otherwise healthy in every respect and who will continue on like the deacon's wonderful one-horse shay. There's no use to live just for the sake of living. The Chinese philosopher Yang Chu in 1300 BC wrote, quote, "100 years is the extreme limit of human life. A helpless infancy and a dribbling dotage take up half. Sickness and suffering, loss and trouble, fear and anxiety occupy the rest." What is the life of man? Where is the pleasure? Dead he is stinking corruption, but how much worse eternal life? It will, in the future, be commonplace to repair certain parts of the body. In my view, this should be a limited endeavor and should not be employed when other parts of the body are diseased or inadequate. Remember Ecclesiastes, quote, "I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. That which is crooked cannot be made straight, and that which is wanting cannot be numbered." And also remember Ecclesiastes, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heavens. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to break down, and a time to build up." Thank you.
Yes, well, it's all right about that, but when? Professor Jack Prost of the Department of Anthropology has courageously assented to be the focus of Dr. Goodwin's questions. And I know you're all as relieved as I am that he's going to answer them for us. Well, that's because at the university, Northwestern University, where he got his bachelor's degree, and the University of Chicago, where he received an MA and PhD in anthropology, there is a certain Midwestern mystique that allows them to prepare young men to answer questions the rest of us are stumped by. Dr. Prost has been at the University of California at Los Angeles since 1958, is a member of a number of professional anthropological associations, and appropriately has written, I think, for one who appears in a series entitled The Human Agenda, on the technical aspect of putting one foot in front of the other. He is a student of the gait and the development of the gait in primates. That's G-A-I-T. I'm sure that Dr. Prost could tell us fascinating things about the development of the gait in primates, as well as the development of the evolution of the human brain. But tonight, of course, his time is preempted for Dr. Goodwin's questions. We're very happy to have with us this evening Dr. Jack Prost.
I'm going to answer all of Professor Goodwin's questions, but I have one piece of data that he didn't give me. I simply want to know, am I going to be the recipient or the donor? From there, all follows, I think. Well, I'm dealing with things that are a little more difficult to handle, I think, than these simple questions that Dr. Goodwin presented us with. So since he didn't have the courage to really go into deep water, I think I shall. So here we go. Let me tell you what I've been instructed to do by reading from your brochures. Quote, "The pace of biological technology has so accelerated that we cannot safely continue leaving anticipation of its consequences only to science fiction writers. The guidance of biological technology, requiring profound reworking of values, demands the zestful devotion of all of us to the unique adventure on the human agenda. A non-biologist respondent will discuss implications for our values. Therefore, I'm supposed to discuss the implications of control of physiologic life and death for our values. Let us note the assumptions I've been given. Number one, biological technology's acceleration will create new problems. Number two, these problems must be anticipated in order to rework our values. Number three, if the problems go unidentified, our safety will be in jeopardy due to unthoughtful and haphazard realignment of our values. My task then is to find the new problems and suggest guidelines for our reworking of our values. Let me start with a definition of values from the Dictionary of Social Sciences. Quote, "Values are broad, fundamental norms which are generally shared by members of a society or subgroup and which serve to integrate as well as to guide and channel the organized activities of the members, in part by giving rise to complexes of derivative norms regulating functionally important areas of life," unquote. I will discuss our fundamental values rather than our derivative values. Derivative values arise in specific situations and are theoretically in keeping with our fundamental values. To itemize all these new problematical situations arising from biological technology somehow doesn't encompass a profound reworking of values that I was instructed to consider. And Professor Goodwin has already done all of the derivative problems anyway. Therefore, I shall consider only fundamental values. Before turning to these, let me summarize in 3 brief paragraphs the basic conclusions I've drawn from our biologist discussants. Number 1, human beings are a particular class of physico-chemical systems organized in complex but predictable and describable ways. If we are not physico-chemical systems, then there must be some known aspect which is unanalyzable, and I heard no mention of such an aspect. If our organization is unpredictable and indescribable, we should notify granting institutions, because they have awarded stipends for the study of almost every human attribute imaginable. We may not be able to predict or describe every facet of being human, but we are committed to the assumption that no human property is theoretically exempt from study and analysis. Number 2, all parts of the human body have necessary functions and subsidiary functions. If we can build a synthetic organ that performs the necessary functions, its substitution will in no essential way disorganize the whole. The necessary functions are essential to the organization of the whole, while the subsidiary functions are essential only to the continued operation of the organ itself. Thus, the heart pumps blood to other parts of the body, a necessary function. But the heart itself needs nourishment, a subsidiary function, and for this it has coronary arteries. If the arteries are blocked, the heart dies of starvation. A synthetic pump can be built, lacking the subsidiary functions and thereby being less complex. This synthetic heart, when installed, or this synthetic organ, when installed, will keep the organization of the whole in operation. In part, death is disruption of the necessary functions of an organ due to its failure in terms of its subsidiary functions. If we know the necessary functions, no organ is irreplaceable. Not a heart, not a kidney, a limb, a tonsil, a stomach, an intestine, a gallbladder, a lung, a bowel, an ovary, hair, teeth. Even a face can be remodeled or restored, and if worse comes to worse, simply covered up with makeup. Life clearly is this collection of necessary functions, operating simultaneously and in harmony. If one function slows down, a stimulant will speed it up. If it hyperexcites, a depressant will slow it down. And candy-coated pills will make this whole adventure aesthetically tasteful. Number 3, the brain is a special case. It cannot be replaced, and the question is why? The brain stores, by chemical change, the memories we have and the conclusions we draw from experience. Every time we have an experience, and every time we think about these experiences, our brain is chemically modified. These modifications store our knowledge, and this knowledge is our resource for interpreting the future and deciding on our future actions. Our individuality and personality, our uniqueness, is stored in the chemical organization of our brains. Take this away, take away this individuality, modify our brains chemically, control our brains with computers, and our life, in a very real sense, is taken from us. Indeed, when we are no longer able to act in accord with our preferences, we are dead. Replacement stops with the brain. To be free, to have free will, our brains must be left alone. But if we are too free, we can be painlessly socialized by relearning or brainwashing or psychiatric help. If we're not free enough, we can take psychedelics and release our id, heighten our imaginations, and take a trip into the chemical world of the uninhibited nitty-gritty. Freedom is good as long as it is within 2 sigma of the mean. Now that we have a firm grip from these 3 paragraphs on our biology, let's turn to our values. We value a transorganic plane of life. We value the existence of a life principle which exists beyond the physico-chemical realm of our material bodies. We assert that this principle can exist even after death. On our programs are written the words psychologic life and death. If life and death were only a matter of physico-chemical systems, then why specify the word physiologic? Why not just the words life and death? So we value a superorganic. As long as a miracle of life and inevitability of death are real, we can postulate a vital principle endowing all life with a privileged status. But what happens when the miracle of life is no longer a miracle, and the inevitability of death is less certain than taxes? Who needs a vital principle? But you ask, would this not undermine our morals, disrupt our society, and throw all into anarchy? If we lose our soul, do we not also lose our morals, our purpose, and our hope? The question of the existence of man's soul has plagued philosophers for ages, and the possibility of life after death is on no less certain grounds than it was for the pharaohs of Egypt. The pagans of Rome must have complained that the coming of Christianity was destroying the morals of civilized society. The Newtonian Revolution was professed to bring in its tide the collapse of justice and propriety. What Darwin did should surely have brought chaos, and for those interested in historical processes, we have a ringside seat from which to watch the decay of communistic society. Somehow man always manages to hold society together, find hope in life, and gain the strength to face death, if indeed there's any death to face. I know of no data to suggest that belief in a soul necessarily makes us honor our parents more, commit adultery less, nor stop coveting our neighbor's property. Children learn their morals from their parents and by observing the actions of adults. Intricate philosophical dialogues deriving proper values from superorganic existences exercise those who already believe they know what is proper. Usually the arguments rationalize already existing commitments. Santa Claus, hot fudge sundaes, and Batman may have more to do with our morals than any volume in the Great Books Club. Psychologists tell us our sex problems derive from experiences which happened well before we could read, Perhaps so too with morals. In any case, biological technology will raise no new problems. These have always been with us and perhaps always will be. Man's concept of himself will not change, and his evaluation of his role in life will be as problematical as it always has been. Perhaps we will posit our biological nature with a greater surety and stand up to our responsibilities with a new awareness of our exclusive and total power, though the prospects are not necessarily encouraging. We value human life. In fact, we value each and every human life. We hold this truth to be self-evident. We are endowed with unalienable right of life itself. Costly medical research demonstrates our concern for the human life. Millions on artificial kidney research. Millions to cure cancer. Heart disease will be attacked next, we're told. We are relentless and unresting in our fight against all those forces which rob youth of its birthright and middle age of its completion. Charity programs around the globe demonstrate our deep-felt conviction that every life is priceless. But with these new biological techniques, problems arise. Who shall be saved if only a limited supply of synthetic organs are available? Who should get the first prototype? Who will bear the expenses of turning successful research programs into cures for everyone in the least amount of time? Will we keep standby teams of experts in all hospitals ready to save the pain-stricken patient? Who will plan the logistics of preventatives, artificial organs, and suspended animations from death? You ask, if these planners are government bureaucrats, won't they play the odds, maximize the benefits with the least cost? Will they program our resources to save 100% of the patients, or only the 95% who have the less costly problems? Will doctors read their brochures on new advances, or will life depend on probabilities of information dispersal? In fact, will your possibility of life depend solely on which doctor you visit first, on which day you get admitted, and to which hospital you drag yourself? And how will our values be reworked when we see that our continued life may be merely a probability, when science has made it a certainty? But what's new in this? Have we ever really believed that human life was highly evaluated anyway? Today we control life and death in our food distributions. Whom we feed and how much food is sent is control of physiologic life and death. Whom we hire and how much money they can spend on medical preventatives is control of physiologic life and death. We kill 100 soldiers per week in Vietnam. Is this not control of life and death? 300 deaths on a Labor Day weekend is not unusual nor unpredictable. When we build cars, we build for 90% of the people. The shortest cannot see low signs, and the tallest cannot see overhead stop signs. If they see, they are uncomfortable because cars are built for the 90 percentile body builds. To manufacture a car in which 100% of the people have maximum vision fields would require a few models for the short, a few models for the tall, perhaps several in between. Tooling for 5 to 7 sizes of seats or windshields is outside the competitive cost margins. 10% of the drivers today are predictably uncomfortable and irritable after a long drive and probably unable to see guideposts. If you are killed by them, it's not totally an accident. We evaluate human life, but not if the cost or trouble is burdensome. New biological technology will introduce more planning and more 90 percentile commitments, but this hazard is with us now and is nothing to trouble our human agenda. We value freedom of action, the free will to act as we please, where we please, and when we please. We're retired at 65, but this only increases our freedom to play and live in California. We can go from log cabin to president, providing in the 3rd grade our aptitude test shows a propensity to be a leader of men. We can eat what we want, providing it's low in cholesterol. We can eat where we want if our skin is white. We can protect our rights in court if we can pay the lawyer. And we can be happy if we can afford a psychiatrist. The humanist tells us that these new biological techniques, these new biological theories make us only mechanisms, determined quantities, and inhuman. We are told scientific theory has finally robbed us of free will, creativity, and the pursuit of aesthetics. Of course, Michelangelo ignored the new science of anatomy, and Dürer the science of perspectives. Cézanne knew nothing of empiricism, and Seurat ignored colorimetry. Clay was steeped, in fact, in logic, Dali in psychology, Duchamp in mechanics, and Oppard in optics and psychology. Artists have always found science a source of innovation, always found science a source of new modes of looking, new modes of analysis, and new techniques of rendering. Our varieties of art owe more to science than to any other sphere of human activity. Opposing science and art makes no sense. New biological technology will bring new representations in art and new values in art appreciation. In short, I simply cannot buy the humanist pessimism. Where then are we left with our profound reworking of values? What are the new problems which will shake our values to their fundamental foundations? The problems I see are different only in specifics, not in generalities. The general problems have been with us since man discovered writing. How do we live with one another? How do we control our environment for our own good? These are the universal problems. Science hasn't introduced these problems, nor modified the basic values involved. Whether we kill with bows and arrows or with H-bombs, we still have the same moral issue. Whether a slave in Babylon or a slave in South Africa, the issue still remains. Whose problem is it? Whether the control of life is with food for the hungry or artificial kidneys for the sick, the problem is who shall gain and who shall control. Whether we are infidels or big brothers, the right to free thought still is a debate. Science gives us more powerful tools of control, but the ability to control has always been there. We cannot blame the biologist or the physicist or the social scientist for our role as controller. Nor do we need new biological technology to awaken us to this role. In a one-sentence conclusion, then, it seems to me we do not need a profound reworking of our values, just the application of the few we already have.
Well, I am relieved. I hope you are. It all seems much simpler now. And I think that in view of the gratitude we must feel for such an improvement in our state, we should invite Dr. Goodwin and Dr. Prost perhaps to interrogate one another on a point or two that they may wish to inquire about further. Well, having made our amenities to gratitude, we can now regress to interest. Who would like to pose the first question?
Well, I have this question. If a person is dead 5 years after he's cremated, would you say that he was dead 5 years before he was born? And I ask this because in each case, is he not equally out of existence? And if he's not dead 5 years before he's born, how is he dead 5 years after he has been cremated? Where does the difference come in? And if he's not dead in either case, then when a person dies and not being dead, where is he?
Reminds me of an old surgical maxim, don't trouble trouble till trouble troubles you.
Was that an answer? It seems that we have been strikingly deprived in the course of these lectures of some contributions from those who are most used to addressing themselves to the problems that have been raised, particularly by the last question. I refer to those who study theology and its related disciplines. And I would like, despite the secular hallowization of these halls, to invite any of those who are expert in these realms to ask questions or to make comments. We don't discriminate against anybody here. So please consider this possibility and let me know by a raise of the hand if you would like to essay an answer to that question or any of the others. I know we have had in previous groups and perhaps tonight also a number of individuals from the clergy, both those who are revealed and those who are cryptic. Next question.
This question is directed to psychiatrists. Usually people will tell you that suicide is no way out of a problem. Does this mean that psychiatrists believe in life after death? Because if suicide is no way out of a problem, where am I now? No, wait a minute, let me start again. If life is just material, that is, if there isn't anything more to it but matter, and you try and live as long as you can, if you're faced with overwhelming difficulties and life is just matter, why not kill yourself and end it? Now, if someone says to you, well, that's no way out, then does this mean the psychiatrists believe that there is something after, there is something more to life than just matter? And if so, why not commit suicide, if there is, and be done with it? Am I making myself clear or not?
I seem to be the only visible psychiatrist hereabouts. There may be others who are invisible, but they don't raise their hands. And I think, first of all, I must say that in response to this question, I can only speak for myself, not for psychiatrists in general. Since we were talking about physiologic life and death, I suppose that raises by implication the question as to whether there's some other kind of life and death. But it wasn't the intent of this series, certainly, to introduce that question tonight. It seems to me that in my professional work, I look upon people who choose to end their lives, not in terms of that decision alone, but in terms of everything else that's going on in their minds and in their bodies too. I wonder if many people don't choose to die in the course of their natural demise in ways which we would not rank as suicide, but which nevertheless actually qualifies as suicide. I've seen patients who decided at the age of 76, when they had cancer and pneumonia, that they were going to live until their grandson graduated from college. And they proceeded to live until their grandson graduated from college, and 2 days later, they died, having stopped eating, drinking, and as much as possible breathing. Now, in such a situation, I don't think one could call that kind of behavior, at least I couldn't, in an otherwise reasonable and usually fairly happy person, a sickness. But the vast majority of those individuals who decide to die, and incidentally that's true even of those who are very old and very sick, the vast majority of those suicides are a manifestation of psychological illness. That is, those that come to the attention of anybody as being a suicide attempt. The individual who just stops eating and drinking is not so labeled. Of course, that's an enormously common kind of thing. But the individual, for instance, who jumps from a height or who swallows painful medication or cuts himself, this is generally an illness. and I think it has to be so qualified, by virtue of the other things that are going on in that person. If you ask such an individual, he tells you obviously irrational things. For example, I was told the other day, I am worse than Hitler. Now, almost categorically, I think one could deny that this is a possibility.
Was he talking about you or about himself?
Next question.
Well, the second speaker, I will agree first with his opinion that he is counter in opinion to the humanists in that they're very pessimistic. But the first speaker made the point that in order to live, we must function. And with the scientific development of subliminal radio, I have a letter from FCC, there is subliminal radio. I would like to know where we, as a mass of people, begin and end with such a thing as subliminal radio that can control the masses by radio control. Now, we automatically give our functional mind to the yes or no of FCC.
Well, I think going back to what I said, control of human beings is nothing new. I mean, the fact that we've discovered all of a sudden that because we're physico-chemical particles, that there are physico-chemical aspects of the world that we don't perceive but which influence us and affect us. These can be controlled at a subliminal level by others, and we take them in, and our sense organs will pick them up though they're not in our consciousness. But this happens every day. I mean, the power of control and the power of suggestion is something that people have used ad infinitum. You were just mentioning the name Hitler. One of the things in sociology is the study of group activity under the influence of a single person speaking. I mean, just nobody knows how they do that. Is it hypnotic? What is it? Well, in a sense, is not the same problem of control? I don't know. Everybody wants to control everybody else, according to some people, and according to other people, this is not the case. Where it starts and stops, I don't know. But yes, this is part of the massive controls that are bombarding us every day from all sorts of directions. And I'm sure that just sitting and watching things on television is a control. You don't even have to go subliminally.
I think we should try to direct our questions to something bordering on the area that Dr. Goodwin has so ably presented us this evening. And I would welcome now a question that's aimed in that direction.
Thank you. To the first doctor, I would address the question, since when we consider the astronomical chances against our ever having even been born, are we not pursuing the wise course in refining life as we are born, and to prolong it also, and not worry about the ones who are yet to come, but to extend the lives that we have now? Is that apropos?
Well, I don't think many people would argue against extending life as long as it's a meaningful life. I am not sure that just life for the sake of breathing and moving is worth extending. And I, for one, wouldn't like to take part in that. I think that when someone has the bad luck to have one part of the machinery break down and all the rest of it be in perfect working order, it makes good sense to try to straighten that out, which is indeed what we do when somebody breaks his leg or has a head injury or appendicitis or something like that. But to try to take the one-horse shay which has suddenly fallen apart and put it back together again for another couple of years doesn't make sense to me.
While we're getting the microphone over, let me point out that at the beginning there was sort of an error. The probability of our being born or being here is 1.0. That is absolute certainty. And that changes the flavor of the question, sort of.
Apparently, I am the only theologian here. I am the chief priest of the anthropomorphic church. Our belief is that all other religions are topsy-turvy, that God or gods did not create man, that man has created all the gods. My question is related to the preservation of life. Dr. Goodwin, you've asked a lot of very interesting questions. Is this justified? Is that justified? And I couldn't help but think, is it justified for a surgeon to perform an operation which is more than routine without completely confiding with the patient and or his family what the mathematical chances of recovery are? If it's a simple appendectomy, that's one thing. But if it's the removal of a tumor in the brain, for instance, isn't it a good bet that he'll live longer without the operation?
It depends on what kind of a tumor it is in the brain, of course. There are some tumors which can be removed and cured and some which cannot be. And this is a matter of judgment on the part of the surgeon. Sometimes he doesn't know until he gets there. It is a good idea, I think, to discuss generally probabilities concerning operations, and I think even in fairly routine operations, when it's a big thing, a matter of life or death, that this is discussed with patients. Perhaps not in a statistical fashion, but in a general fashion to get an idea of what to expect. So I agree very much with what you said.
Doctor, how do they decide which person should have an artificial kidney?
The question is, how do they decide which person should have an artificial kidney? Those of you who read Life magazine will have read something about that. The experiment in Seattle, Dr. Scribner and his group, and what they did was to set up a committee, of which doctor was one member, but they had other members of the community to participate in this decision, and clergymen and businessmen, etc., to decide who was the most useful member of the community, or who they wanted to give the kidney to. Now, this gets to be a pretty hard line to decide, and I'm not sure that a committee can do it any better than one person when you come down to that kind of a decision. And sometimes these decisions are made almost by caprice or by accident or by what's going on at that moment. For example, we here at UCLA, the people who run the artificial kidney that we have, can only take so many people at a time. It's a fact. It's like so many seats on a streetcar. And when the seats are full, there's not room for anybody else to get on. So if you happen to come along the day that a seat is just emptied out, well, you might get on the streetcar, but if you don't, you haven't got a chance. Oh, she wants to know, what about the qualities in the person who should be chosen? Now, this is a complicated decision, but the basic one is, first of all, that we're dealing only with kidney disease and not with something else, and pretty much in a young person. So that if we have a young person who's perfectly normal in every respect except the kidneys are bad, then that's a good candidate. If we have somebody who's 85 years old whose kidneys are bad, but who also has a bad heart and a bad brain and so on, why, we wouldn't even think about it.
I think now we should step across the hall for a question or two, and we'll be back very shortly. Gentlemen, would you follow me?
Dr. Prost. Oh, okay. You said that your basic thesis was that we already had a set of values and that the problems that we will encounter won't be very different from the problems we have today, and we can use the same set of values. But my question has to do with the fact that the problems in the future will be of a greater scope than they are today. For instance, in the past, you mentioned we could kill people with bows and arrows, but now we can kill many more people at one time. And that this greater scope is probably the reason that we want to examine our values today. And my question is, do we really have a set of values that we can apply to future problems? Rather than, say, redefining our values, maybe we have the job of defining them.
Now, what I was indicating is radioactive. It might be. What I was indicating is that we're going to have to talk about whether we mean objective values or normative values, and this is why I was hung up on exactly what to say in terms of normative values. The point is that the basic problems have arisen ad infinitum when you phrase them and you just rephrase them a little bit into a past age. There's a series of communities that have thought of all of the various different ways of evaluating this. In terms of the basic values, though, they're the very fundamental, the ones anthropologists consider the real core of your ethos, so to speak. These values are things that are not determined by whether you kill one life or a million at one shot. It's a question of what does a life mean at all, and this type of thing. At that level, for these very highest values, no matter how much science improves our tools of doing bad things or improves our ways of doing good things, the fundamental values still are absolutes to be determined in some absolute way about the nature of life itself, of human beings, and our situations. So that in all the details, you're quite right. Every time a new scientific advancement comes up, something that's not in the law books is judged. But supposedly we use our fundamental values to derive these derivative ones, so they say. We find out, in fact, we don't. Many times it goes just the reverse. We set the precedent, and then we look at a whole bunch of them and say, aha, that's what we really believed in at the top all along, you see. So that's a whole other problem.
Dr. Prost, I can't let this pass somehow or other. It seems to me that we've got to come to the grips with this fundamental problem. You have said that there is a fundamental absolute which dignifies the preservation of life at all costs. Now, I want to ask you, in front of all these people who will bear witness to your answer, what do you say? Suppose you stretch our imaginations now to the point where we have achieved the capacity to lengthen the average human life to 500 years. Now, can you imagine that some other fundamental premise than the absolute of just preserving individual life might then take precedence as a value? Or would you say that in that circumstance, no reworking of our fundamental values would be required?
I would say no reworking of our fundamental values would in fact be required in terms of what is basically fundamental. Now remember that what we're getting down to here is, what I said before, I'm not talking about the objective, I'm talking about normative, in fact, values. I'm judging what we hold as our normative values. Nobody knows what the true objective ones are, but in terms of the three I mentioned as seeming to me to be the very key ones, it seems to me that the basic values we have will stay the same. There's a delightful play I might mention, just out of perversity, I suppose, by George Bernard Shaw, so you'll have to read it all, called Back to Methuselah, in which he deals with exactly this problem. What happens when you start living longer and longer and longer? And, of course, one of the things that happened was that they kept reaching for more and more things until finally they got to the point where they could actually create a human being in all respects exactly identical, so that these elderly people, 500 years old, could create a perfect human robot who was organically perfect. And, of course, the problem was that these organic robots had love affairs and had human values and everything else. And then they had to get rid of them because they didn't like it because they weren't doing what they wanted them to. And, of course, the end result of this is that even when you reach the perfectionist stage, you're stuck with some basic human qualities, and Shaw was just itemizing these and saying they just continue.
Okay, anybody else want to propose a question? We have one that has been written. I'll read it later.
I am directing my question to Dr. Godwin. We have noticed that it would be natural for old people, that is those who have been already born, to die away, and the new ones allowed to be born. Science has devised methods of birth control, that is a way by which the number of people who are born on Earth is limited. At the same time, science is trying to help those with worn-out parts to hold on to life desperately. In your opinion, is this fair to mankind?
Well, I've already said that if there's one worn-out part and all the rest is working well, then I think it's a reasonable effort. But I'm not one to involve myself or my beliefs in supporting a completely collapsed one-horse shay, because I don't think it's right. So I think you feel somewhat the way you would about a man that had been hit by an automobile. If you could put him back together again and let him go on about his business, why, you'd try to help him. And you wouldn't feel badly about that, nor would you consider it was unfair to the rest of humankind. But if he'd been completely splattered, you probably wouldn't try to do that. If you'll pardon a personal reference on this subject, yesterday I went out to visit my father, who's 84 years old, and whom I love very much. And he's had a series of strokes, and he's still an active old man, but his latest stroke has left him without the ability to speak in a normal way, wherewith he, being a proud old Yankee, doesn't speak at all. He just smiles and he can understand everything that I say to him, but he can't talk back to me. Now, I know that sometime, I don't know just when, but sometime soon, he will go further down this course and will die from it. I would consider it inhuman to try to prolong his life beyond his natural span.
This may be the appropriate moment to raise the question which was put on a card. Dr. Goodwin has introduced the subject. The question reads, how do the speakers feel about euthanasia?
Well, this is a problem that's worth a lot of discussion. As a physician, of course, I cannot approve of that on moral and legal grounds. Also, as a physician, I can say that I've seen a number of people who were nearly dead, who I think benefited by not having what the Catholic Church calls extraordinary treatments. It's not exactly euthanasia, but at least it's not an obligation to go all out to keep the machine running for the next 2 days when it's obvious that the patient is that close to death. So as a physician, I cannot approve of euthanasia, although I've already told you how I feel about the prolongation of life beyond reason in my own father.
You said that morally you could not. Legally you are kept from approving of euthanasia, but does your vow control your own personal morals?
Dr. Goodwin, I think one's own personal morals are protected by something or other. If you choose not to engage in a discussion of them, I'll protect you.
No, I don't mind. I said legally and morally. And certainly legally we know of. Morally, it happens to be my own belief that this has no place in the practice of medicine. This can be approached in a matter of perhaps of degree, and then we begin to come around to definitions which can be very difficult. I have seen people who were dying inch by inch who were benefited by stopping intravenous fluids, for example, or by stopping an oxygen tent. And this I don't consider to be euthanasia in the sense of the question. And I think that there's hardly a doctor who hasn't been in that position at some time in his career. But to make a decision, and this is where my morals come in, that it would be proper for patient A to be dead through my decision and my act is something that I'm not prepared to do on the basis of my own morals.
Let me ask another question that has something to do with morals. Stretching biological technique a good deal, probably of even centuries ahead, it appears likely that we may be able to regenerate a whole human being from some somatic cell. Let's say either a germ cell or any other cell of a human being, by causing it to regress back to its embryonal multipotentiality, as it's called. Now suppose that we could take a cell of one of your patients, Dr. Goodwin. Dr. Prost, you have something to say about this too, perhaps. And by treating it with certain chemicals, cause it to regress down to its infantile possibilities of regenerating a whole person. Would you consider it morally acceptable to regenerate that whole individual only in order to use him as a donor for the individual from whom the original cell was taken?
That's quite a question. And unfortunately, my logic and my philosophy and my morals are all mixed up when I come to a public discussion like this. I have to fall back on my belief that, and then you'd have to tell me otherwise, that each person is an individual, and that it would be, by definition, impossible for this to be the same person. And if that were so, and if it were not the same person, then I wouldn't think that I could justify doing an experiment on someone who wasn't the same person. I could justify taking some skin from my own stomach and putting it in my ear, or for someone else, and even as an experiment. But to submit someone who is not the same person to an experiment which was completely done by me, I couldn't justify.
Well, basically the answer to that is, what are identical twins? You see, so the situation whereby you might argue this is that what happens if you regress the cell and then grew the cell in an entirely environmentless situation, so it had no experiences, nothing. If you could really imagine such a thing, I think biologists would argue it's impossible totally ever to do this. But if you could, then theoretically you would have something that had, for all biological purposes, no individuality other than a culture. Where that gets us, I don't know, but certainly the problem as originally posed is just an identical twin problem.
Well, of course we do that with cells. We grow them against their will, as it were. But we're talking about cells, not about people.
Well, as I understand it, it is now not possible to grow a whole duplicate of the body of a human being because the cells become disorganized from their tissue structure when you grow them in culture. Apparently, the organization of cells into tissues and tissues into organs and organs into a whole physical entity depends on certain chemicals which we now don't know how to master. Presuming that Dr. Prost's idea came to pass, and that was really what I had in mind, an accelerated regeneration of a somatic copy of a human being without culture, without environment. Let's suppose that the cell could be brought to that state of physical maturity within a period of 3 months. You'd put the man on an artificial kidney for 3 months, and while in a completely dark glass bottle, his copy was regenerated so that you could, at the appropriate moment, borrow his kidneys. Now, that's not the same individual, but in Dr. Prost's terms, it's not an individual. It's a spare part collection.
All right, let me then raise the other question, which I think is a very simple one. Let's take eugenics. You see, it was argued at one time that people have bad genes, and all we have to do is sterilize or knock off the people with bad genes, and we're all home free. And of course, this brought up all kinds of issues. But while they were doing that, people were discovering the nature of DNA. So instead of knocking them off, you can get in and modify the gene, probably as fast as we ever could get an effective eugenics program even blueprinted. The point is that science changes so fast that the original question is meaningless. Now, in this case, you see, the obvious thing I jump to is, why take the cell and worry about it? If we got all this control, why don't we grow the cell into a kidney alone by giving all the substitute environment so that the kidney has no brain whatsoever and is just a mass of kidney cells? So we, so to speak, culture a kidney from a person's old kidney cell. And at that point, you don't even have to play the argument. You see, you just put it right back into it. So we may solve our own question with science, so to speak.
I think you can solve everything with science, and you can spoil any question by being reasonable. We will now migrate back to the other auditorium. I hope you'll forgive us. Could I ask you to come over to the side a little way?
I was just thinking this evening, we were asking the question several times, whether we are justified in prolonging life. And I think if this question comes up, we might be on the border of asking the question, which is the question of euthanasia. If we are justified, if we are not justified in prolonging life past the normal human lifespan, then perhaps we are not justified in prolonging life past infancy either. Now, the second part of what I was thinking was this, that this question of death, let me reorganize a minute, whether or not you believe theologically in an afterlife, it seems to me that the question here is really not so confusing. Just that life is purely material and that you want to prolong it anyway. If you are in a position where you are leading a merely vegetative life, you are not living any life at all, and so your good has ceased to exist already, and so there's no need to prolong the question.
I would like to make things a little more difficult by posing this question to you. Let us suppose that a 47-year-old shipping executive is injured in an automobile accident at the time when the new freezing techniques are made available, so that his damaged body, which, let's say, has had thoracic injuries, so that he needs a new heart and new lungs in order to go on with his still fairly youthful life. After freezing, the soul, which we will postulate for the sake of this discussion, has been present in this man, even though he's a shipping executive, has continued its existence, which was present before. And then a couple hundred years of terrestrial time pass, hardly noticed by those in celestial observatories. And at that point, some of Dr. Goodwin's medical descendants decide to bring this man back. Now, naturally, none of us can answer this question, never having been called upon by the circumstances to consider it. But what would we say about the value judgments that are involved in forcibly wresting a human spirit out of the afterlife, calling him back to the heretofore without so much as his permission? He may not like it here anymore. Does anybody want to answer that question?
I believe Washington Irving wrote a story concerning something like this.
Washington Irving wrote a story concerning this.
Yes.
Rip Van Winkle.
No, I don't want to relate the story, but I'd like to ask a question. But I mean, even at that time, you saw the inadvisability of bringing someone back after so many years. But I would like to ask a question. I'm quite intrigued with the mechanics of this kind of thing. Has anybody bothered to work this out? Who is going to give up an organ or a life for someone else? And it seems to me that as far as the scientists are concerned, this is not their province. So that the one who has power or influence or a great deal of money can go on buying kidneys and hearts and lungs for 500 years. Now, what kind of a society are you going to have? And these others, they're going to be contributors of hearts and lungs, and they're going to be buyers of hearts and lungs.
I'm sure you addressed that to Dr. Prost.
Yes, that's an imaginable situation, but if you really work out sort of the logic of what all that means, and then take a look at real life and industrial revolutions and everything, the problem I keep coming down with is that you use different terms and your techniques and tools are a little more refined, but the same problems are right here with us. And the question is, what are we doing about them today? So that when you study normative values, all you have to do is go around and look and see what's happening today. And in fact, it is true that to some degree, money gives you the ability to preserve your life in certain various ways. Ways are, for example, to have constant checkups, very thorough constant checkups, and the other is to fly to specialists and so forth whenever any possibility comes in, so that this is already sort of something that's with us. And to test our values here, you need only sample everybody and find out what are their values. These are our normative values, so that there they are. Now, the future problems are basically different than these. And my question is, will the values really change?
Dr. Goodwin, you mentioned that the requisites for a transplant would be youth, possibly a sound body with possibly one diseased organ. My question is, how do you feel about an Einstein of advanced age with maybe one or two diseased organs who could possibly be given another 15 or 20 years and thousands of other men like him and still contribute their knowledge and welfare to the rest of the world?
I wouldn't be standing in the way of such a thing, but as a surgeon, I would be able to tell you that his chances of surviving it would be much less than a younger, healthier person. And when I was talking about that a moment ago, I was really speaking from bitter experience. in our present state of organ transplantation, that whenever we have someone for a kidney transplant who's over 40 or who has all of the things that can go with this, with renal failure, of an advanced degree, then we're in trouble. And it's hard enough to do one thing at a time. Now, if you want to project this into the future where it's easy to do, all you have to do is wave a magic wand, then that raises another problem and makes your question more germane to the issue. And I could only say that I think that you'd have to, that every day in every hospital, and as far as I know, forever in the history of man, there have been decisions made about who's going to do what. And I would suppose that this would still continue, that somebody would have to make that decision, and it would have to be made at the time on the basis of existing evidence.
Dr. Prost, you seem to feel that the present normative values of the culture will be sufficient to deal with any new questions that arise. I don't think that this is likely to be the case. In many of the particular examples that have been brought up, I agree that they can be applied. But let me suggest one. A present normative value is that we should not kill people. Well, should we conclude then that it is our moral obligation to presently save cells of everyone that's alive so that later on there will be the chance that they can be reconstructed? Does this follow from our present normative value or not?
Well, what is it basically that is stopping this from being a possibility? If it were quite feasible and inexpensive, wouldn't we just do it?
Perhaps we can do it.
All right, I'm saying, well then, why don't we, start doing it?
I'm not sure we feel the moral obligation.
Yes, but at the same grounds, there's a lot of other ways in which we could save a lot of other lives without saving cells. For example, life expectancies in large areas of the world today run down around 25 years of age. Now, the cause of the death here is very cleanly known. I mean, you don't have to be a doctor to know why they're dying. It's pretty obvious. It's just a matter of money to go out and take care of their lives. So that what I'm really saying is not that I know what our values are, but I'm saying that with respect to many of these problems, you already know what your values are because you're acting them out right now with analogous problems. And I'm sure our values are going to change, but let's not believe that we should start talking now about what they should be 100 years from now, because right now we've got analogous problems we ought to be solving if we are really going to think that this whole area of values and what they are is a relevant area of discussion. And if it is, then the values today are just as important as what they're going to be 100 years from now.
Dr. Goodwin, if the values today are supposed to be so good in all this, why doesn't our legal profession give the physician some help in his decision as to who should live and who should die, whom the heart-lung machine should be stopped on and who should continue receiving help, etc.? Does not the matter of life and death and the continuance of, prolonging life lie with the legal profession, and should not the decisions be made by a jury? After all, this is a democratic country.
It is?
That's a very nice question. I don't know the answer to it, but I can tell you what some lawyers said at the meeting I was attending on this subject. They said that these are medical matters. They said, you doctors go ahead and do what seems right to you, and the law will be generous in trying to help you.
Speaking of euthanasia, is it true or false in the case of a terminal case, do we have medication today that actually is effective where one is experiencing excruciating pain? The truly effective.
Yes, morphine is tried and true. It's just a matter of the dose.
Dr. Goodwin, since the human body is an integrated thing, if you'll pardon the expression, and since each organ is either directly or indirectly interdependent upon one another, how can you say that the human being is totally healthy when one organ is totally diseased?
I can't say that per se. You know, the Navajo Indians believe that when somebody's sick, it's because there's a disharmony, and that the way to get well is to get harmony back again, and that's not so far off. The medicine men will take a sick person and paint a picture on the sand, and they'll say, see, this is your disharmony. Now we're going to fix that. And then they'll erase the picture, and then they'll paint a new one, and they'll say, now see, this is your harmony, and this is the way you're going to be. And this works very well, almost as well as some of Dr. Gorney's sessions. But to come back to the question, I suppose what you're asking me is if someone has terrible kidney disease, and how do I know that there isn't something else wrong with them? And this is a matter of degree, because most people who have advanced what we call terminal kidney disease also do have other things. They may have, usually have high blood pressure, for instance, and they may develop other things that go with this. And it's our job, simply at the moment, in terms of trying to know how best we can succeed, because we're trying to stack the cards in our favor, to rule out other serious things. And for example, we won't do this on someone who has a serious infection, because we've learned the hard way that even if we succeed technically, that during the period afterward, when they're taking these poisonous drugs which prevent the rejection of the kidney, it also prevents the body's reaction to the infection, and the patient will die of the infection. So this is a matter of medical judgment, not a social judgment.
Dr. Prost, I'd like to ask you a question about the relationship of death to evolution. I mean, in this series, we've heard a lot about such physiological processes of death as collagenous tissue, how it agglutinates over the period of the lifespan and causes death, resulting in things like arteriosclerosis. First, do you think that death, in other words, a certain programmed time of death is related to a species, is adaptive to its ecology, and how? And second, do you think that this programmed death is controlled by certain genetic processes would also be adaptive?
Well, this gets into the whole question. I can only refer to Medawar, who's written on aging and discussed some of this, and suggested that in part death may be the result of genes that are not advantageous to the organism, whose timing has been delayed off of what the normal reproductive span would be, which probably primitive societies runs about 25, 22, somewhere in that, or maybe a little later, around 30. So that, in fact, there is some suggestion relative to sort of a minimum timing limit that, in fact, our general body size and things like this may have added up to make some determination of this. However, remember that you can't evaluate anything unless you have the environment also specified. And the problem is we're changing our environment so fast that all this specification of how long should we live by evolutionary rules is nonsense. It's how long should we lived if we had been cavemen, maybe. But we're obviously not cavemen, and the environment is tremendously different, and therefore nobody knows precisely what now are the proper evolutionary limits. And I think it's even meaningless to wonder what they are.
I think we have come to the end of this evening's question period. Surely.
Could I give you one parting quote? It's from Shakespeare, Julius Caesar. "The coward dies many times before his death, a brave man but once."
This evening's discussion is the last of our double lectures. Next week we will have a final symposium, the nature of which is very difficult to predict, since it will feature 6 of our UCLA faculty members, some of whom you've heard from before, like Dr. Elof Carlson, who spoke about genetics, and Dr. Colin Young, the representatives of the Theater Arts Department who responded to Dr. Carlson. We will also hear from others, Richard Morris from Sociology, Arnold Mandel from Neurophysiology, and of course, in addition to some others from the faculty, Norman Corwin, the noted radio and screenwriter, will be our special guest. I will welcome you all again for that last session. I hope in the meantime that you recognize that learning takes place and confidence is established with familiarity. It has not occurred to me till now to remind you about the ordinance against smoking. And one last word. We've spoken about euthanasia and the intricate problems as to whether one can precipitate his own demise. It reminded me of a quote from an aged swain of 87 who brought his 19-year-old fiancée to his general practitioner's office. When the general practitioner remonstrated with him and said, "Now, wait a minute, Sam, a thing like this could prove fatal," his humanistic optimism asserted itself, and he said, "Now, listen here, Doc. If she dies, she dies."